This lecture, I want to look at how different cultures classify food, the different semantic systems they have for looking at and classifying food. Semantic systems, classification systems, are a way of mapping our everyday experience, of mapping the world. And that's a metaphor. But if we actually look at the literal way that we map the world, we can see that the way that we map the world is not really based upon, is often not based upon objective criteria. It's very much based upon very much subjective criteria. So you can begin to see that when you compare maps of the world, one based upon the Mercator projection, which is the traditional projection of the world, going as far back as 1519, and then a more updated modern version of the world projection, and that's the Gale-Peters projection. Now, if you compare the two, one glaring difference, of course, is that in the old Mercator projection, Greenland is the same size as Africa. Well, that is just not the case. As you can see in the Gale-Peters projection, Africa is 14 times bigger than Greenland. So clearly the Mercator projection expresses a certain ethnocentrism, a Eurocentric view of the world, and there is Europe in the center of the world. And it's also enlarges the northern hemisphere and kind of reduces the southern hemisphere. So what do we take from that? What we take from that is that when we look at the world, we create systems that map our experiences. And very often our experiences are subjective. And in that case, we can begin to see how different cultures experience the world, the same world, but they begin to classify it in different ways. One way semantics has gone about classifying phenomena in the world is a system called semantic features, and these are essential features, and through a binary system of pluses and minuses, we can begin to determine the particular categories that we have for the world. So, for example, if we take man, woman, boy, girl, we can begin to look at their semantic features in terms of plus human, and of course they're all plus human, and then man is plus male and plus adult. A woman is plus human, plus female, and plus adult. And then you can distinguish boy and girl by the minus adult particular semantic features. And so what we got then is a particular plan, as you can see it there, which distinguishes each category. And this is a way of looking at and categorizing phenomena in terms of essential features. One of the problems here, of course, is that we don't always use these particular words in these particular ways. If you think of girls' night out, we're not thinking of children here, we're thinking of adult women, but we use the word girl. And boys will be boys could be applied to men of any age. Another problem here, of course, is that we've mapped gender in according to two dimensions, male and female. Well, is it possible to map gender in more than two dimensions? Well, it certainly seems to be the case in India, which has recognized the third gender, and more recently Australia also has on a passport, an Australian passport, the possibility of indicating a third gender. Okay, so let's use the semantic features then and see if we can come up with the semantic features, the essential features of a bird. And you can pause here if you wish and make some notes, plus and minus, so that you get to the essential features of a bird. You may have come up with something like this, and maybe you can argue that there are other features here that can be added. We know it's plus animal, and an essential feature of birds is they lay eggs, and an essential feature of birds is they have wings. But of course, they may not fly. Ostriches, emus are not flying birds. Penguins don't fly. Um, so we have a plus or minus there. You may have got some other characters there too. Um, so Lear, in his particular article, tries to do a particular semantic mapping of cooking vocabularies. And here he's trying to look at the essential features of different types of ways of cooking. So he starts with the broad term cook, and then reduces that to the hyponyms boil, fry, broil, and bake. And then within those, he looks at simmer, full boil, and then under fry, saute, deep fry, grill. Grill goes a little bit under broil, and barbecue, and roast goes under bake. And then it gets even finer when we look at simmer. We can stew, we can poach, and we can braise. So what he does is look at the essential features of these particular cooking terms. And he tries to come up with something like this. It's an attempt, a cross-cultural attempt. He does look at various languages, English, French, Japanese, Chinese, although you might want to argue that it's still pretty ethnocentric in terms of the kinds of cooking means he's looking at. It's an interesting approach, and again, one in which we try to use essential features to begin to kind of understand how we categorize the world. One of the problems with essential features, though, is that sometimes it's very hard to actually precisely distinguish what the essential features of a particular object are. So, see if you can try this. Using semantic features, define the difference between a cup, a bowl, and a mug. And again, you might want to pause to give this some thought and see if you can come up with some semantic features to distinguish them. You may have come to the conclusion that it's not that easy to distinguish between bowls and cups and mugs. I've just got some pictures here of mugs and cups, and as you can see, in the real world there is quite a variation in terms of what we can refer to as a cup. We can have those metal measuring cups, paper cups. We can have what's sometimes called a chalice, but also is a cup and saucer. And what makes a cup, and when does it become a mug? Notice we can have coffee mugs with or without handles. And then, of course, we can have those cups as trophies. What you begin to understand here, that it's not always easy to think of objects and the world in terms of essential properties, but more in terms of family resemblances. So when we think in terms of family resemblances, there are those who look more quintessentially like the matriarch or patriarch of the family, and others who look less like that. And what this leads to us to, and what has led semanticists to, is the notion of prototypes. So instead of thinking of essential features, what we tend to think of is what is prototypically a cup or a mug or a bowl. And the early work on this by Eleanor Roche, looked at particular animals. So for example, what comes to mind when you think of a bird? So, you know, it's the first picture that goes into your mind. Probably it's going to be the one on the top left there, which is a robin, rather than a chicken or an ostrich or a penguin. And this became, of course, a very important part of understanding semantic categories, the notion that cognitively we have a prototype. Okay, so if I said the word cat to you, right, you probably have a prototypical picture in your head of Tiddles, your pet cat. rather than a picture of a lion or a tiger or that kind of a cat. One of the problems with this, of course, is that prototypicality changes with culture. So what is prototypical in North America in terms of a bird such as a robin is not prototypical in Europe. So Europe, the prototypical bird would probably be the blackbird. And then in South Africa, that other bird there, the red-billed quail, is considered to be a prototypical bird in that part of the world. Okay, so we talked about Mercator and the Gale Peters projections, and we used that as a kind of a metaphor to try and understand how different cultures cut up the world, how they map the world, and literally how they cut up a cow. And here's the contrast between an American cow as it would be butchered on the left and the British cow as it would be butchered on the right. And it's very interesting to look at the kinds of conventions whereby American butchers begin to understand the meat of the animal in many ways differently to the, say, the British. So you can see that area there which the British called sirloin and flank, which covers a very large area. In the American butcher, notice how that's divided up into short loin, sirloin, tenderloin, top sirloin, and bottom sirloin. So what we know is when cultures classify the world, some cultures may have a couple of divisions, a couple of classifications, whereas another one may have many, many different ways of looking at the same thing and breaking it down. Let's think of furniture, for example. We call this breadth of association. How far does a particular term go? How many, what's the breadth that you cover when you use a particular term? So in English, when we mention the word chair, it tends to have a breadth of association of both an upright chair and an easy chair. Okay, and that's what we probably think of. But it only goes as far as those two. It doesn't go as far as sofa, and we need a separate word for that. Similarly in Polish, similar to English. But when we think of French, we have three different terms. So chaise refers to the straight back chair, and fauteuil refers to the easy or armchair. And then if we think of Chinese, we have another difference in categorization. Straight chair is yizhi, whereas shafa takes in both easy chair and sofa. So all the time we are looking at cultures and looking at the way they map the world in terms of semantic categories. And it becomes very interesting to compare these particular categories across cultures. So which is a fruit? Probably you decided that the melon there is the fruit and everything else is a vegetable. Whether you do this or not probably depends on where you come from. If you come from North America, then certainly you'll say, oh, the melon's a fruit and everything else is a vegetable. But that varies from culture to culture, and it also varies in terms of popular classification and scientific classification. So you probably know of the long-standing discussion about tomato, whether it's a fruit or a vegetable. Well, it depends how you look at it. Botanically speaking, tomato is a fruit like watermelon, green pepper, eggplant, cucumber, and squash. In fact, all of those pictures of food on the previous slide that you probably came to the conclusion that there was only one fruit, the melon. In fact, botanically, are all classed as being fruits. Okay. So a fruit is any fleshy material covering a seed or seeds. But that's only one way of looking at it. We can look at it from a horticultural point of view. And from a horticultural point of view, from the point of view of the people who grow these things, the tomato is a vegetable plant because it's an annual and it's a non-woody plant. So fruit would be associated with woody plants. So all the time we have various ways of mapping the world, and it also depends on what particular role we're playing. Are we an everyday person looking at the world and saying, would you like vegetables? Here's tomatoes. Here is squash. Okay? Or are we looking at the world from the point of view of a botanist? Or are we looking at the world from the point of view of a horticulturalist? If we look at Chinese and their particular classification of fruit, then we also find a different way of breaking down the same real world experience. So the Chinese make a distinction between gua and guo, and gua refers to melons as distinct from squash. So that seems sensible to distinguish melons from squash, but notice they're still under the category of fruit. And then if you look at guo, an interesting distinction here is that into nuts, and perhaps you didn't think in terms of nuts as being classified as a fruit. Well, it's certainly not classified as a fruit in our culture, but in Chinese it is. And then what we traditionally call probably fruit is shuiguo, which is juicy fruits. And there you can see the traditional things that we recognize as fruits, apples and oranges and grapes. Okay, so one other way of looking at classification, and that is to look at it from a legal perspective. That is, what does the law say is a fruit or what is a vegetable? Well, it's very interesting to look at some legislation on this, and this goes back a long time, and it goes back to ways in which American farmers were protected against imported food. And so as far back as 1893, the Supreme Court actually decided that the tomato was a vegetable and therefore subject to a 10% tax, import tax. And this was very much reflecting a particular fight against growers of other kinds of fruit and vegetables. So the court conceded that, botanically speaking, tomatoes are the fruit of a vine. It further held that the common conception of the produce is as a vegetable, and made the same distinction with cucumbers, squashes, beans, and peas, none of which are vegetables, botanically speaking. The court stated that the tomato is a vegetable since it is served as part of the main course of a meal, and not like fruits generally as dessert. So that was a legal kind of distinction, not based upon scientific classifications, but more based on popular conventions. And because it had to pay that 10% tax, of course, it meant that fruits, which didn't have to pay it, okay, were more competitive. More recently, in terms of legal classifications, we can think of the way that local toponyms given to food are protected through kind of legislation, like, for example, the French Appellation d'origine contrôlée. So in 1925, this is when this system first came into existence in France, and cheese was the first food to be protected in this way. The law was further enshrined in European law, which stated that only cheeses whose ripening occurred in the natural caves of Mont Cabalou in Roquefort-sous-Soulzan were permitted to bear the name Roquefort. So the general idea was 1925, but it was more codified and specified to refer to all the specific cheeses. So a Roquefort can only come from this particular area You can't make it in the United States. You can make a type of cheese similar to Roquefort, but you can't call it Roquefort. And so this also applies to wine, of course, and perhaps wine is the greatest user of this kind of control. And until very recently, champagne was a term that was used generically, and it was used generically by American growers such as Corbel. Um, uh, and more only recently has there become restrictions on the use of the word champagne. Champagne, of course, has to be grown in the area of Champagne in northern France. But a loophole in the American law allows sparkling wine to be referred to as champagne as long as it's labeled such that the name of the appellation of the place of origin is on the label. So this one label says Russian River Valley Champagne or California Champagne. Okay. Notice this also describes the method champenoise. I mean, it's been made in a similar way to champagne, but it's not champagne. Also, if we think of the way that we use words to describe experiences, we'll also see differences between popular and official definitions of particular terms. And of course, it's one of the reasons that we tend to get kind of confused, or to put it more bluntly, misled when we're wandering the aisles of the supermarket looking at food and reading labels, and we see words like free range. And now probably if you think of free range, like I do, you think of a prototypical chicken running around a prototypical yard with grass and maybe trying to fly a little bit and standing on a chicken coop and things like that. Well, according to the United States Department of Agriculture, the definition of free range is that poultry that has been allowed access to the outside. That outside could be as small as 3 feet by 3 feet. It's not what we think of as being free range. Similarly with natural. Natural is a very misused term, but in terms the official definition of the term natural by the USDA is that nothing has been added to the bird after slaughter. No flavoring, no brines, no coloring. Okay, so the bird could have been fed lots of nasty things beforehand, lots of chemicals, nitrates. It could have been kept in a battery, but it still can be labeled natural after its slaughter. Likewise with cage-free, hens laying eggs labeled cage-free are uncaged inside barns, so they don't actually go outside. They are within a barn, but they're not within a cage. So they're not free range. Of course, they may have a better life than the free range chickens that only have a little space to go outside in. But these terms, notice these terms, the way that they express our experience of the world are quite different from the popular to the actual legalistic view in terms of the designation by the United States Department of Agriculture. One of the interesting ways that we actually classify food is classifying it in terms of what it is similar to. And this is the case with non-indigenous food. So food that comes from somewhere else, we usually call it by the name of where it came from, either a country or Western or Eastern or even barbaric. And then the next part of the particular naming procedure is to look at what it's similar to. Okay. So in China, tomatoes are called Western eggplant. So what does that mean? They come from the West, but they look like eggplant, which are familiar to Chinese. Similarly, winter squash becomes Western melon. Squash is imported, it's not indigenous, melon is. So a squash looks like a melon. And pineapple is Western jackfruit. And there's a picture of a jackfruit. And you can begin to see the similarity, right? And but it's not a Chinese fruit. And then we can look at other particular countries and languages. This is Malay. And Malaysia, Indonesia had a very strong Dutch colonial influence. And so particular foods that the Dutch brought into this part of the world, okay, were referred to as being Dutch, and then they were likened to a local particular food. So an interesting one is rabbit. Rabbit was brought by the Dutch to Malaysia. And so the Malays said, well, what does it look like? Well, it looks like a cat, but not just a domestic cat. Actually, they're thinking of a civet, which is a type of cat, which of course is eaten. Turkey becomes Dutch chicken. So turkey, of course, is something that doesn't exist in Malaysia. Chickens do. And then a sheep, again, something which is new to this part of the world, is brought in by the Dutch, and it's likened to a goat. So we have Dutch goat. A very interesting example of how this particular naming works is the naming of the word turkey. Right? Note that the actual origin of the word turkey is really based upon a mistaken identity. There are two birds, the guineafowl and the turkey, and the picture there is a picture of a guineafowl, which originates from Africa. Turkey, of course, originates from the Americas, North and South America. So when the first colonialists came to the Americas, they mistook what they saw as a turkey for a turkey. They mistook it as a guinea fowl, and they were familiar with this. And interestingly enough, these birds originally were called turkey fowl. Why turkey? Well, because the guinea fowl that people ate probably came from Turkey. They probably originally came from Africa, but the trading route took them probably through Turkey. And so where did these birds come from? They came from Turkey. Oh, okay, well, we'll call them turkey fowl and then shorten it to turkey. It's very interesting if you look at some other words like this in other languages, you get this similar naming convention. So in French, dinde, the French word for turkey, is a contraction of the original from India, dinde, of India. And you can see it the same as well in the Polish word Indyk, meaning coming from India. So the trading convention was that these particular birds came, the guineafowl came from this part of the world, and so this is how it was named. And you can see it also in Turkish, where you got the name for Turkey in Turkish is Hindi. And also with the Dutch have Kulkun, which is a contraction of the original, I can't pronounce that, which comes from a town in India called Calicut. So it's hen of Calicut, and so we arrive at the name. So a very conventional way of naming foods, of classifying foods, is where did it come from and what's it similar to? Just to look at some more of the complexity of semantic classification. Of course, depending upon the particular cuisine, you might have extensive descriptions of particular types of food. So it's very interesting to read this article by Alexander, The Geography of Pasta, and to look at all the different kinds of shapes of pasta and all the possible names for them. So here's about 9 different shapes, starting with the spaghetti family. And the spaghetti family is described according to the thickness of the spaghetti. So if you look at the top of that list, you'll see particular names. And there's one there, the second one down, strozzapreti. That's a very thick pasta, as thick as a pencil. And strozzapreti means choke the priest. Strozza meaning is strangle or stroke, and prete is a priest. So I don't know when it was originally given that name. And maybe somebody made some spaghetti and they invited the village priest around, and he had an unfortunate dining experience. So spaghetti is just one particular categorization. And then, of course, you can go on and see all of these other types of pasta: tubular, shells, ribbon, sharp pasta, micropasta, filled pasta, and dumpling, which really means gnocchi. It's kind of a potato. It's not. It's a pseudo pasta. Um, and so these particular names vary according to the particular shapes within the larger shape name, and they also vary in terms of geography. So when we think of semantic classifications, we can see how that particular cultures, food cultures, can be very rich in classification based upon the particular type of food that they're eating. And so this is a representation of how cultures have particular classifications which are more or less important to them. And this is the way they begin to map the world, to see the world in terms of these semantic systems.